So let's talk a little bit more about what does Walsh mean when he's talking about the real and natural, right? What sorts of examples does he provide us with? Well, one of the most important examples in the text is, of course, that of the sapphire itself, right? And he spends some time looking at the difference between artificial and natural sapphires. If you recall, of course, Walsh says, the only way that you can actually tell the difference between a natural sapphire and a artificial one is if you are trained as a gemologist, right? The typical naked human eye, someone who's not trained to recognize these differences, won't actually be able to tell the difference. And of course, in fact, the price differential is on the side of the artificial sapphires, right? Obviously, artificial sapphires are much cheaper. Again, only a trained gemologist can even tell the difference. So the question is, why would someone then pay for something that is more expensive and you can't even tell the difference, right? Unlike the example, returning to last lecture, of conspicuous consumption, like the Ferrari, like the Desire handbag, the whole point is you can tell the difference, right? I mean, again, it could be a knockoff, right? But the idea is to, have a brand or a mark that is clearly stated, noticeable, and it leads to a difference, a differential in the level of status for the person who purchased it. Well, so in other words, the difference here is one of something that you can't actually see. It's cheaper to buy the artificial sapphire. Then why are people turning to the natural sapphire? Well, of course, the very concept, this idea that it is natural, that it is real, that it is special, that it is, as Walsh says, one of a kind. But in fact, even natural sapphires are enhanced, right? And Walsh spend some time describing how it depends on how they're cut. There's different kinds of treatments that one can actually do to natural sapphires to change the hue or the color or the brilliance of the gemstone. So the point here is that there is no one natural sapphire. Even natural sapphires are artificial in a sense, right? But Westerners, not just Westerners, sorry, those who purchase sapphires are doing so because they believe that it matters, right? But they believe in this concept, this idea that a gemstone needs to be special and one of a kind. Now, of course, this idea of one of a kind is something that Walsh extends to tourism in Madagascar, and especially to the Encarna National Park, where he is conducting field work. And so really he's thinking about ecotourism more generally, right? How it's one of a kind in the sense it's the only place where many of these plants and animals are endemic to this particular forest in Madagascar. But you can also think of other places that an ecotourist would be willing to go to because guess what? That other place is in its own way also one of a kind. Well, I want to step back and talk about tourism more generally as a kind of cultural phenomenon. Some of you maybe if I have any folks who've taken art history courses, maybe literary courses, those of you who've taken courses that think about questions of kind of European culture in the 17th to 19th century might be aware of the Grand Tour. This was a cultural phenomenon which typically upper class young men, not always, but typically, especially if those from the UK, Germany, Scandinavia, and less often from the US, these upper class, usually again aristocratic men, would travel to mainland Europe, specifically Paris. That was an important site. But the pièce de résistance was to get to Italy, to Rome, Venice, and Florence, and to look at great works of art, to study kind of Greco-Roman traditional art and Renaissance art as well. So the idea was this is not something that everyone can do. It differentiates one in terms of one's status, right? And it's also this idea that to be a cultured individual, one should tour this particular place in Italy, right? Italian art. Well, similarly today, of course, you can see examples of tourism being a way in which one marks status, right? Selfies in front of the Eiffel Tower or something, for example, to mark that I was here, can also have a kind of an element of status differential to it. But even today, tourism is still a kind of liminal experience. And some cultural anthropologists who write about ritual have actually described tourism itself as a kind of ritual, right? It's this liminal experience. If you remember from the lecture on religion, liminal is that betwixt and between state during a rite of passage, right? Neither here nor there. You're in the middle of this ritual. So tourism is liminal in the sense that it's kind of between your everyday life, right? It's this marked period of time in which you're able to go off, do something else, change your daily routine. And part of tourism, in terms of ecotourism, of course, is involved in the search for authenticity, right? Walsh differentiates this from, say, beach tourism, right? Or imagine tourism that involves going to a place like Disneyland. That's the exact opposite of authenticity, right? That's just kind of make believe, fun, play. Tourists who are really worried about authenticity don't want to run into other tourists, right? They want to believe they're going to a place that has been untouched, right? And Walsh talks a lot about that in terms of these tour guides, right? These Malagasy tour guides who are very adept and clearly understand Western tourist culture. They recognize that tourists want to be catered to, but not too catered to, because then that would symbolize the fact that they're not the first tourist to go to this particular part of Madagascar, for example. So of course, part of what I want to think about is what do we even mean by authentic and authentic culture, right? This is a very problematic term and concept. There is no idea, there is no one culture that's kind of untouched, as I mentioned earlier. And we can think about this as well in terms of authenticity, right? There's no such thing as an authentic culture. Here's an image of a representation of the Grand Tours by Giovanni Panini from 1757. The title of the painting is Ancient Rome, and you see these guys kind of with their books, kind of studying, looking at the artwork in front of them. So I'm going to end with essentially a slideshow of pictures and my own experience as someone who at that time was only maybe a year or two out from, well, 2 years out from my own undergraduate experience. Or when I was living in the Indian Ocean at that time, and I spent several weeks in Madagascar and in the same region that Andrew Walsh is writing about. So I thought I would talk a bit about my own trip to a protected forest, and that forest was Montagne d'Ambre, the Amber Mountain. And it's interesting as I read his text to think about this kind of ethnography of encounters as one between the tourist and the toured, between the eco-tourist and the Malagasy tour guide, because I had a similar experience many times over in Madagascar. Even as an anthropologist, you kind of run into these situations where you're taken for a tourist. But this was before I was an anthropologist, well, before I started graduate school. And Montagne d'Ambre, I want to just give some information here, is the oldest national park in Madagascar. It's near an old volcanic massif, with a 1,457 meter summit. So here I was. Here's the tour guide that took me around. Now, guides are actually required in all of Madagascar's national parks, and this is something that Walsh himself notes. I, at that time, was visiting Madagascar during the height of the rainy season. There's a lull. There's not many tourists that are, in the country at that point, and I had wanted to go to the summit, to go to the massif. And so my guide was like, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." But he had a machete, so he was helping us kind of make our way through this very dense vegetation, as you can see. There's the lemur waterfall. Part of what was interesting is how Gary, the tourist, was narrating the various elements of this park to me, right? He would say, "This is a sacred waterfall," or look at, and he was very clear to try to point out the various, animals that he could find, from the lemur to, yes, here's that very small chameleon that Andrew Walsh points out that that Gary very quickly found for me, as well as this other chameleon that very easily hid in the or was camouflaged in with the tree trunks. And this is actually an image of, I was kind of wondering, what is this? Because it didn't seem like a natural stream. So I asked Gary and he kind of paused and he said, oh, actually, and he hesitated and finally came out with the fact that, oh yeah, this is what the French colonial officials, because the city of Joffreville, which is located near the park, was a big important center for Creole and French men during the colonial period. He said this was a trench that the French dug during that time. So again, here's an example of, something that we understand to be natural. This national park in the middle of Madagascar in the rainforest isn't ever really completely natural, right? It's not untouched by man. And the fact that Gary tried to, not deceitfully hide it, but the fact that he was hesitant to share that with me, maybe tells us something about the way that he understood tourists as looking for that which is untouched, which is natural. And here we are at the summit. I just wanted to share this picture with you. We reached the top at around noon. And right as we got up at the summit, a few minutes later, it started to rain. Remember, again, this is the rainy season, and it would rain all the way down till we reached camp. By the time I got back to the camp, I was absolutely covered in leeches. Yep, that's right. They're these little leeches about the size of your fingernail. And Gary warned me, and I wore long socks and, long sleeve shirt and pants and everything, but I was still covered. All right. On that note, I will see you all on Monday, and we will continue our conversation on Made in Madagascar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.